An Ottawa video featuring Mark Carney rejecting U.S. control over Canadian energy policy triggered immediate turbulence across commodity and currency markets on Tuesday, with traders repricing uranium, government bond yields, and the Canadian dollar within hours of the remarks. The clip, which spread rapidly through financial and political circles in Washington and abroad, also prompted concern inside the White House as investors assessed whether the statement signaled a broader shift in North American energy leverage. Carney's message was blunt. Canada would not accept outside direction over its energy assets, export strategy, or regulatory decisions. That stance landed at a sensitive moment for markets already on edge over supply security, trade friction, and the role of critical minerals in the global transition economy. For traders, the issue was not just rhetoric. It was the possibility that Ottawa was drawing a harder line on who gets to influence the flow of uranium, oil, and related strategic commodities. By mid-afternoon, desks in New York, London, and Toronto were reporting fast-moving adjustments in uranium-linked equities and contracts tied to nuclear fuel exposure. Bond traders also moved quickly, pushing yields higher as they reassessed policy risk and the likelihood of a more confrontational posture between Ottawa and Washington. The Canadian dollar, which had been trading on broader risk sentiment earlier in the session, began to reflect a different story. Not just macro pressure, but political signaling with direct implications for trade and capital flows. The White House reaction was described by multiple market participants as immediate and uneasy. Officials were said to be alarmed by the speed with which the video circulated and by the market response that followed, especially given the sensitivity of energy security discussions in both countries. One senior analyst in Toronto said the clip didn't read like a routine policy comment. It read like a line in the sand, adding that traders treated it as a potential warning shot rather than a one-off remark. The most visible repricing came in uranium, where investors have been watching any sign of tighter Canadian control over supply chains, licensing, and export policy. Canada remains one of the most important players in the sector, and even a modest shift in perceived policy direction can move pricing and sentiment across the nuclear fuel complex. When Ottawa speaks this clearly, the market does not wait for a memo, one commodity strategist said. It recalculates immediately. Treasury and sovereign debt markets also reacted to the possibility that the dispute could spill into broader trade and industrial policy. Higher yields reflected the view that a more assertive Canadian stance could complicate cross-border investment assumptions, especially in energy infrastructure and processing capacity. Currency traders, meanwhile, began treating the Canadian dollar less as a passive oil proxy and more as a live political instrument tied to the outcome of the dispute. What made the episode stand out was not only the substance of Carney's remarks, but the timing. Global markets are already sensitive to disruptions in supply chains, sanctions risk, and election cycle volatility. And the Ottawa video arrived in the middle of that uncertainty. For now, the immediate question is whether the statement becomes a one-day shock or the opening move in a larger contest over North American energy control. By the time the clip reached peak circulation, one phrase had already taken over social media and trading chats alike. Arctic Claw starts trending worldwide. The U.S. framework, now emerging in Washington briefings and market notes, centers on a Treasury-supervised clearing mechanism that would sit over Canadian energy flows and give American officials a hulled, direct view of transactions tied to oil, gas, uranium, and hydroelectric power. According to people familiar with the discussions, the mechanism would not simply track volumes after the fact. It would require settlement, reporting, and compliance checks to run through a structure that Treasury could monitor in real time, effectively turning energy trade into a supervised financial channel. In practical terms, that means every major movement of Canadian energy into the U.S. market could be treated as a cleared transaction, with the federal government holding the keys to timing, documentation, and authorization. That is where the politics get ugly. Fast oil shipments from Alberta, gas deliveries tied to industrial demand, Uranium used in nuclear fuel cycles and electricity from Canadian hydro facilities are not fringe assets. They are core inputs for U.S. consumers and manufacturers. So when Washington frames the issue as administrative oversight, Ottawa sees something else, a system designed to sit between Canada and its own export earnings. With Treasury acting like the bouncer at the door, the numbers explain why the reaction in Canada turned sharp. Energy exports to the U.S. are embedded in long-term contracts, pipeline access, grid coordination, and nuclear supply chains, which means any clearing rule can ripple far beyond one. Commodity desk, a Treasury-supervised mechanism, would not just touch a few trades. It would influence how counterparties price risk, how banks process payments, and how producers plan output across multiple provinces. In market terms, the proposal matters because it converts trade into a controllable choke point. If approval, reporting, or settlement can be slowed, flagged, or denied, then the financial side of energy becomes as important as the physical side. That is why traders are reading this as more than a regulatory memo. It is a map of where pressure can be applied without firing a shot. The hydroelectric piece is especially sensitive. Canadian power exports into U.S. border states are often treated as boring infrastructure, the kind of thing nobody notices until it breaks, but a Treasury overlay would pull even that into the same compliance architecture as oil and uranium for utilities, banks, and industrial buyers. That is not a small paperwork change. It is a signal that energy interdependence can be managed like a sanctions regime if Washington decides the relationship needs discipline. Canadian officials, meanwhile, are said to be parsing the framework as a direct challenge to sovereignty over strategic assets. The issue is not whether the U.S. can monitor flows. It is whether it can convert that monitoring into leverage over pricing, access, and timing. In Ottawa, that reads less like cooperation and more like financial coercion, dressed up in bureaucratic language. One senior Canadian policy source described the mood bluntly: if Treasury controls the clearing lane, then the trade lane is no longer neutral. That view is now spreading through government and industry circles, where the concern is that a mechanism built for oversight could become a tool for pressure whenever bilateral talks turn tense. Canada reads the directive as financial coercion. At 6 a.m. in Ottawa, Mark Carney moved on 3 fronts at once, launching early calls to the Bank of Canada, the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, and officials tied to Basel-based financial coordination as his government worked to align a response without turning the dispute into a public brawl.
China has also entered the frame with its own warning, signaling that the widening North American dispute could complicate already fragile trade and security calculations in Asia. Chinese officials said the confrontation was another example of instability among major economies and cautioned against what they called politicized trade behavior. The warning matters because Ottawa has been trying to balance its reliance on the U.S. with a broader push into Asian markets, and Beijing is making clear that it is watching the U.S.-Canada fight as a test case. That creates a nasty little triangle. Canada wants diversification, China wants leverage, and Washington is making the bilateral relationship more volatile by the week. Analysts say the result is not simply diplomatic noise. It is a shifting map of risk for exporters, investors, and governments trying to read where the next shock will land. When the world's second and third largest trading relationships start looking unstable, everyone else starts pricing in the fallout. Inside Canada, the conflict is also stoking Alberta separatist concerns, a development that federal officials had hoped to avoid while already juggling external pressure. Alberta's energy sector has long complained about federal policy, and the latest U.S. confrontation is giving separatist voices a new opening to argue that Ottawa cannot protect provincial interests in a hostile trade environment. The argument is simple enough. If the federal government cannot secure stable access to the U.S. market, why should provinces remain tied to its strategy? That line is resonating in some corners of the province, where frustration over pipelines, regulation, and revenue sharing has never fully gone away. It is not yet a mass movement, but it does not need to be to matter. Political scientists say separatist sentiment often rises when external pressure exposes internal fault lines, and this dispute is doing exactly that. The federal government now faces a two-front problem: defend Canada abroad while keeping the country from fraying at home. Then there is the Arctic, where military signaling has started to move in sync with the diplomatic breakdown. Article 34.7 now sits at the center of the dispute, and that is where the real legal fight begins. If the review process under the trade agreement fails, the parties are left with three possible outcomes: a negotiated fix, a formal panel ruling, or an escalation into retaliatory measures that could harden the split instead of resolving it. Each path carries different costs, but none of them restores the old assumption that the system will quietly absorb a political shock and move on. Under the agreement structure, Article 34.7 is supposed to function as a pressure valve, not a wrecking ball. It gives governments a procedural route to challenge conduct they believe violates the rules, but it also creates a paper trail that can lock both sides into positions they may not be able to walk back from without looking weak. That is the problem now. The more each capital frames the other side as acting in bad faith, the harder it becomes to use the process as a release mechanism instead of a weapon.
Cameco, Canada's largest uranium producer, then invoked force majeure on select contracts, a rare legal move that signals a supplier says it cannot meet obligations because of circumstances beyond its control. The company did not frame it as a political statement, but the market read it the same way. If the paperwork stalls, the fuel chain stalls with it. The rare earth side is no smaller. Ottawa has begun applying stricter scrutiny to outbound shipments tied to critical minerals used in magnets, electronics, guided systems, and advanced manufacturing. According to government officials familiar with the process, that review is aimed at keeping strategic materials from moving without closer oversight. But it also slows the flow of inputs that defense contractors and industrial buyers depend on. Every week, for reactor operators, the problem is not abstract. Uranium is not a commodity that can be swapped out on a whim, and even short administrative delays can ripple through enrichment schedules, fabrication timelines, and utility procurement plans. One energy trader described the situation as a paperwork choke point with real physical consequences, which is industry code for the bill is coming and it is not waiting for a press release. The defense sector is feeling the same squeeze from a different angle. Rare earths are embedded in high-performance systems where substitution is limited and inventory is often thin, so tighter export review can force buyers to revisit delivery, assumptions, supplier lists, and contract timing. In practical terms, that means manufacturers may have to choose between slower approvals and more expensive sourcing, neither of which is a fun option when production lines are already locked in. Officials in Ottawa have been careful to present the measures as risk management rather than retaliation, but the timing leaves little room for pretending this is routine. The controls were activated as Canada's broader response moved from private consultations to operational restrictions, signaling that the government is willing to use licensing authority as a pressure point if Washington keeps pushing on energy-linked trade flows. By 9:41 a.m., Carney speaks on camera. By mid-morning Monday, Mark Carney was framing Canada's widening dispute with Washington as a direct test of sovereignty, warning that control over payment rails, energy flows, and export licensing had become a political weapon as markets surged, and trading halts spread across several commodity-linked desks. The message, delivered while the Pentagon and allied capitals were already reassessing their exposure to U.S.-managed infrastructure, was blunt. This was no longer just a trade fight, but a systems fight. Carney's argument was not subtle. He cast the confrontation as a choice between national autonomy and external system control, saying Canada could not treat critical infrastructure as a neutral backdrop when access, settlement, and licensing decisions were being used to pressure policy. In practice, that meant the dispute had moved beyond tariffs and into the plumbing of modern commerce, where payment channels and regulatory choke points can do more damage than a headline-grabbing levy. Markets reacted like they had just been handed the script for a bad sequel. Commodity desks reported sharp volatility in energy and metals contracts, while risk managers moved to limit exposure. As the current scale of the Canadian response became clearer and traders priced in additional interruptions to cross-border flows, several trading venues briefly halted activity in fast-moving names tied to uranium, rare earths, and industrial inputs, a sign that the market was not waiting around to see whether diplomacy could keep up. The reaction inside government circles was just as immediate. Officials at the Pentagon and in allied capitals began reviewing how much of their procurement, settlement, and logistics architecture still depends on U.S.-controlled or U.S.-aligned payment systems. According to people familiar with the discussions, that review is not limited to Canada. It reaches into the broader question of whether defense supply chains can remain stable if financial routing becomes part of the geopolitical dispute. For Washington, the uncomfortable part is that the leverage is not theoretical. If a country can slow licensing, tighten export review, and question the neutrality of payment channels at the same time, it can force buyers, banks, and contractors to rethink where they clear, settle, and source. One senior market participant described the situation as a system stress test with political branding, which is WAL, street code for everybody is pretending this is manageable until the back office starts screaming. The exposure is especially sensitive for allies that have spent years assuming U.S.-managed rails were simply the default setting. That assumption now looks shaky. Defense ministries, central banks, and treasury teams are quietly asking whether a payment network tied too closely to one jurisdiction can still function as a reliable backbone when that same jurisdiction is part of the dispute. Carney's office has not dressed up the shift as a temporary flare-up, and that is what has rattled officials the most. The framing suggests Canada is prepared to treat financial and trade infrastructure as strategic territory, not just administrative machinery. And that changes the game for everyone who depends on it. If the dispute keeps moving in that direction, the next response will not come from a press conference. It will come from back offices, compliance teams, and allied finance ministries. Europe, meanwhile, is already beginning to plan a break from U.S. rails.